All right, so today we'll introduce a whole new topic. So we have discussed market, the supply demand, and then we introduced the theory of the firm. And now we will discuss the role played by the government in this lecture and the following two lectures. Now you are probably aware of Trump's tariff policy. I mean, that is something that we'll discuss about, right? So today we'll talk about tax. Tariff is basically a special form of tax that you impose on the goods imported from foreign countries, right? We will focus on that in our lecture 11, right? When we talk about international trade. But today we'll discuss taxes, right? So the phenomena, the principles that can be applied to taxes are also applying to tariffs. So after today's lecture, you are also able to have a better understanding of tariffs. Right? I know that we have not completely finished our discussion on the monopoly, so we'll finish these government actions first, and then we'll get back to wrap up one discussion question related to monopoly that we left from previous lecture. Right? Okay, so before we start, let us answer this following question, right? The government wants to discourage smoking. We know smoking is bad. So that's why the government usually would impose higher taxes on some goods that are not healthy to people, right? So they want to impose this $3 tax. Now the question is, which of the following tax form would be more effective? The first choice is to make producers pay the tax, and the second choice is to make the smokers pay the tax. Think about this. Right? It may not be that obvious. I mean, if you have some thoughts on this, you can raise your hand virtually and just share your opinion. Right? Um, but we will discuss this, right? So the answer is not that straightforward. So I can first review the answer. Theoretically, in theory, it doesn't matter which party of which side of the market would pay the tax, right? So theoretically, it's the same, and we'll discuss why it is the case, right? So that leads us to these two major topics we'll introduce today. The first one is price control, right? Basically, the government want to impose the maximum or minimum price on a certain goods that the consumers will need to buy, right? And that's the price control. And there are two forms of price control. The first one is price ceiling. You specify, or the government specify or impose the maximum price that the price can be. It cannot go over this price. It's called the price ceiling, right? And also price floor, meaning that the minimum price the companies or the firms can charge, and the price cannot go lower than this, right? So that's a price floor. And then we discuss taxes and answer the question that was proposed in the previous slide. Now, price control is a very widespread phenomena, right? And also it also has a very long history. So here you have the Code of Hammurabi that was proposed by the Babylonian king in 1754 BC, right? So that's like almost 4,000 years ago. And this is the first documented known price control, right? So price control, as we have briefly mentioned, there are two forms. Price ceiling is the regulation that makes it illegal to charge a price higher than the specified level, right? We will use the example of rent control to discuss the phenomena, the effect of price ceiling, right? So price control is very prevalent, and it's not that prevalent, or the price control is not that binding or restrictive in Denmark, but we see in a lot of major cities, price rent control is a very popular policy, I would say. And we'll see how does the rent control influencing the housing market. And then price floor is another type of price control. It's regulation that makes it illegal to trade at a price lower than the specified level. So this is also known as price support, right? So uh, in the United States, for example, there's a price support for corn, right? So that would cause a surplus of corn to be produced by the farmers because now they can sell the corn at a price higher than the equilibrium price, right? So we will use minimum wage as an example to discuss the effect of price floor. How does minimum wage influence the labor market? So as we will see, price control can result in surplus or shortage, right? And surplus and shortage are actually price phenomena, right? So they do not mean that there are too much or too little of something are produced. It just means that the price is forced out of equilibrium that generated this surplus or shortage, right? So when you are allowing the price to adjust the supply and demand, then they will always get into the equilibrium and there is no surplus or shortage. Only if you impose some restriction that the price is not allowed to reach equilibrium price, there will be surplus or shortage, right? So that's why we say surplus and shortage are price phenomena. It doesn't mean that there is too much or too little of something produced. Now, rent control. Rent control, or say is also called rent ceiling, is a price ceiling that is applied to a housing market. It is implemented in many cities in New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco, London, Paris, right? So in Denmark, there's a general, very mild form of price control, like the apartment, the houses that was built before 1992, for example, I believe, you cannot charge a price higher than a certain price, right? But for newer houses, newer apartment, there's no restriction. So the price control or the rent control is not playing a major role in the Danish housing market, but not many other major cities, New York, Los Angeles, you see it has a great influence. Rent control above equilibrium rent would have no rent ceiling above equilibrium rent would have no effect because the equilibrium is below the rent ceiling, so it will not have any effect. But when rent ceiling is below the equilibrium rent, meaning that the price will be forced below the equilibrium, it will create a housing shortage and increased search activity because now the tenants have a difficult time, very difficult time to find some apartment to live in, and also a black market, right? So that's the consequences of rent control. So let's take a look at of the effect using supply demand. Look at the market. So here is the housing market. And the rent is denominated in US dollars, right? So here we have the demand and the supply for housing, right? So the quantity represents thousands of units of housing per month, right? And here, if we allow the market to reach equilibrium, we see that the intersection between the supply and demand represent the equilibrium. So we will have the equilibrium price, which is $1,000 per unit per month, and the quantity rented out is 80,000 of units. Right? So far so good. So here, if you allow the housing market to reach equilibrium, that's what's going to happen. Now, suppose the government, for some reason, maybe try to satisfy the voters that we don't want the housing price to be so high. We want affordable housing, so they just impose this rent ceiling of $800. That is lower than the equilibrium housing market price. Right? So what's going to happen? After the imposition of this price ceiling, that means any price higher than $800 would be illegal. So you are not allowed as a renter to set the price higher than the ceiling. Okay, so because the price cannot reach the equilibrium price now, it has to be forced to be 800. So what is going to happen? Right, think about this. I mean, this is something that you can directly apply what we have learned from supply demand to understand this. we have a price of 800, right? Now, at this price, the quantity demanded will be represented by this point, that is 100 thousands of units, while the quantity supplied is only 60. So that is telling us because the price is lower than the equilibrium price, there will be a lot more quantity demanded, a lot more people would want to rent this unit, this housing, but not that many sellers or renters, house owners are willing to rent out their apartment or house. So in this case, we will experience a housing shortage. A lot of people want to rent a place, but not a lot of the renters are willing to sell this place, to rent out their place. Right? So this housing shortage is not only a shortage, it's also increase some inefficiency because you will need to search a lot more time in order to find some place to live in. Right? So that is the opportunity cost of housing also. Right? Even though if you find somewhere to stay, you pay a price lower than the equilibrium price, and that's a good deal for you. But there are a lot of people who are not able to find a housing place, right? And also at the same time, for those people who are able to find this housing, I mean, they spend probably a much longer time to find this housing. So that is the opportunity cost of finding housing. So that's all these are part of the inefficiency. And also this housing shortage would create a black market. Right? So it is just illegal arrangement between renter and landlord. For example, you have a long waiting list as a tenant in order to get this housing, right? In order to to find a place, maybe you just give a bribe to the landlord so that they are able to prioritize you, right? And also discrimination can also happen, right? So because there's a housing shortage, it is the landlord's market, the seller's side's market. So they have more bargaining power. I mean, they can decide. I mean, they can refuse to rent out this housing to some type of people they don't like. So this is also a part of the efficiency. So now, because of this housing shortage, it creates a black market. So this black market price is usually above the rent in the unregulated market, right? So if the market is not regulated, the price is 1,000. But if you take into the consideration of the search cost, the opportunity cost of searching, and also this black market, the price eventually the renters will need to pay is much higher than this equilibrium price, right? So because if you see at this quantity, so only 60 units, 60,000 of units are available on the market. If only this amount of units are available on the market, the maximum willingness to pay by the buyers, look at this quantity, and the maximum willingness to pay is 1,200, is 1,200, right? So this is the maximum the buyers are willing to pay, right? So this also represents the maximum black market rent that the renters, the buyers are willing to pay, right? So now let's take a look at this inefficiency of the rent control. This rent ceiling below the equilibrium rent would lead to underproduction, right? So as we see, we have this underproduction. The quantity supplied is only 60, while the quantity demanded is 100, right? So that creates a shortage. And also because of this underproduction, the consumer surplus and the producer surplus is just this amount, right? And here, what about this part? This could be a part of the consumer surplus, but sometimes because of the search activity, this part of this surplus can be lost due to this increased search activity. But there is part of the surplus that is for sure lost. That is the deadweight loss here, right? So this is something that we have learned from the topic 5. When you have this corresponding underproduction, we will experience this deadweight loss because if we again look at here, for the quantity between 60 and 80, the marginal benefit represented by the demand curve is higher than the marginal cost of providing this service. Right? So if you are providing this service or this service is traded in the market, the corresponding benefit is higher than the cost. That is value created. But because you are forced to produce only 60, this part of potential benefit, potential value is not created. That is the deadweight loss from this policy of rent control, right? And also here, the pink part, right? So this could be a part of the consumer surplus. If this part if it eventually is the customers who value the housing most get the corresponding housing unit, and also the search activity is not that high. I mean, this could be part of those consumer surplus. But because of the search activity, right, you spend a huge amount of time searching for the corresponding available apartment. I mean, these could also be lost, right? So these can be taken away from the consumer as the consumer surplus. That's also part of potential loss, right? How much the loss is depending on the search activity. Now let's take a look at what's going to happen for the demand side and the supply side. So demand under rent control, the tenants would seek larger and more apartment under a controlled price, and they do not want to move out when apartments are not even the apartment they are having now are not in need, because I mean the corresponding price is actually much lower than their maximum willingness to pay, right? So it's lower than the equilibrium price and much lower than their maximum willingness to pay. So eventually, when they get a apartment to live in, I mean, that's good news because it's very affordable price. So they don't want to move in. They don't want to move out to allow other people to get into the apartment, right? So many rent-controlled apartments are passed from one family members to another to avoid being removed from the program. Because when you finally get the apartment, you take so much time of the search activity to get an apartment. Definitely, you don't want to give it away to other people, right? So you just maybe get it, you get your friend to get it, and get your family members to get it. So in New York, statistics show that turnover rate of apartment is less than half of the national average because of this rent control. And the proportions that never moved for more than 20 years is twice the national average, right? And also, 49% of rent-controlled apartments had one occupant in San Francisco, while 47% in Manhattan compared to 27% nationwide in the United States. Right, so here, San Francisco and New York, they are under rent control, right? And because of this, there's a shortage of housing. And once you get some apartment to live in, you don't want to move out because it's a very reasonable price. And also, you may be thinking that the rent control is good for the poor to help them to get the affordable price to live in. But it turns out does not necessarily help the poor. Families that have lived in a city for a long period of time, they are usually not the poor, they benefit from the rent control. Right? So when you have a long history living in the city, I mean, you know where to get the apartment, and usually people who live in the city, they are usually not the poor people. New York Congressman Charles Rangel, he had 4 rented controlled apartment, one of which is used as an office. I mean, the congressman, I mean, we probably don't consider them as poor people, right? But they benefited from this policy. And this mayor, Ed Koch, kept his rent control apartment. He lives in the official residence for 12 years, right? So he not used his apartment, this rent controlled apartment. He just lived in the official residence, but he kept this rent control apartment because it's such a good deal, right? It's much lower than the equilibrium price. And because of this, I mean, other poor people, they are not able to get into the rent controlled apartment. And some Hollywood stars, they kept rent control apartment in Manhattan, right? And that's another signal indicating that it's not necessarily the poor who enjoyed this rent controlled apartment. Usually this policy, although aimed at helping the poor, eventually it helped the rich or the privileged, right? So here is an episode from Friends that illustrating this idea of rent control, right? So you know that if you watch this TV series Friends, it occurs in New York City, actually in Manhattan. And here, one of the main character, Monica, she inherited this rent control apartment from some old lady. Right? So in this episode, Monica acquired her suspiciously beautiful apartment, at a very affordable price, when her grandmother moved to Florida. And if some official check, right, so randomly check whether it's indeed her grandma who still lived here, he mentioned to her friends that if anyone asks, I'm an 87-year-old woman who is afraid of her VCRs, right? So this is demonstrating that these people, right, who already live in the apartment, they enjoy the rent control. And because of this shortage, they are unwilling to move out their apartment. It generates this issue of shortage, and people who really need apartment, they cannot find a place. So New York people often turns to the daily obituary list in the New York Times, right, to check who actually passed away in order to find some available apartment. Otherwise, it's not able, right, to find some anywhere to live. And New York Post, they check this obituary in the New York City Times and New York Post to track down a potentially vacant apartment for rent, right? So usually a lot of people actually they live in New Jersey and they commute to New York in order to find somewhere to live. Right? And so that's the demand side. On the supply side, it also have these negative consequences, right? So the suppliers, right, the landlord, they are not willing to doing anything that incurs a cost because there is already a shortage in the market. I mean, even if there's some issues with their apartment, they don't need to fix them because if it's a very poorly maintained apartment, there are tons of people who are willing to live in, right? So they do not want to incur anything that incurs a cost because they do not they want to minimize the cost related to their providing the housing. The price ceilings means a refusal to pay the full cost of maintaining the apartment. And the low rent makes it unprofitable to maintain or build new buildings. Right. So the issue with this low price is not only it creates a shortage, but it also creates some disincentives for the new uh, suppliers, right, to build new apartment because these buildings is the rental price is lower than the equilibrium price. It's not profitable for them to build new buildings. And the scarce resources will not be allocated to alleviate the shortage in housing. And also discrimination can enter when deciding who receives the housing. So that means the quality would deteriorate over time, going worse over time because of rent control. Since as a landlord, I can rent out my apartment even I don't do any maintenance, any fixing of the issues. Why should I bother, right? So this is an illustration. This is a dilapidated apartment building in Mumbai, India, as a result of rent control because of this lower price. It cannot actually cover all the costs related to proper maintaining of the housing. So the landlord would refuse to do the maintenance, and that would cause the deterioration of the quality of the housing also. Right? It's not only a shortage, but also the deterioration of quality of the current existing housing. So to illustrate that shortage is a price phenomena, let's look at some examples. There's a severe housing shortage in the United States during World War II through the ratio of, though the ratio of housing to people was the same as before the war. And also more than half of San Francisco's housing was destroyed due to the earthquake and fire in 1906. But even though half of the housing was destroyed, I mean, there's no shortage appearing in this period because back in 1906, there's no rent control, right? And because of this, the price of the housing can adjust based on the supply demand, even though the supply actually shrink to half. and the price would rise accordingly. And this price would actually balance the quantity demanded and quantity supplied so that there's no shortage. But during World War II, because of the rent control, even though the housing is the same as before the war, because of the rent control, it actually generated some shortage. Price controls on food, right? So we have also only talked about rent control. Now, here are some discussions of price controls on food, right? This has been leading to hunger and starvation. 17th century Italy and 18th century India both occurs because of this price control on food. The government will say that the food cannot be go over a certain price, but that policy may be aiming to help the poor, but eventually it will generate this shortage of food. That leads to starvation. And eventually the policy that aim to help the poor actually make the poor in a worse situation, right? And we also have this French after the French Revolution, Russia after this Bolshevik Revolution, and Africa countries after the independence in 1960s. These are all due to this price control on food, right? The government imposed the maximum price that the food can charge. And because of this price is much lower than the equilibrium price, there's now enough supply to satisfy the demand. And also it does not give enough incentive for firms to provide the corresponding food. So shortage becomes more serious over time as supply and demand become more elastic, because we know that, right? Talking about the elasticity of supply and demand over the long period of time, because the suppliers and demanders can adjust, right? So it makes the supply and demand more elastic, and this shortage would become even worse when the suppliers and the demanders adjust to this shortage. So here is a quite interesting example of how price control can lead to the falling of a nation, can lead to the losing of a war, right? So this is the price control behind the fall of Antwerp. That is due during this 80 years war against against Spain. So back then it's like a Spanish empire, right? So a ruling Dutch. Antwerp used to be a city in the Netherlands. Now it's a city in Belgium, if you visit Belgium, right? So this occurs in the city of Antwerp. So the Spanish troops actually blockade to starve Spain's rebellious subject in Antwerp into surrender, right? Because of this blockade, the price of food rise significantly, dramatically. Right? The high prices of food within Antwerp cost others to smuggle food in, right? So because it's very difficult to get food, so the price of food in Antwerp rised dramatically. But because of this high price, it's actually a good incentive for people to smuggle in the food, right? To help the people inside Antwerp. So the authorities within Antwerp think the price is just so crazy. It's not reasonable. So they decided to set a price ceiling, a price control, right? So they want the food to be affordable to people within, to the citizens within Antwerp. But it's actually just did the opposite. Because of this price ceiling, this price control, food supplies declined significantly, because now it's risky to smuggle in food to Antwerp. And because the price now is so much lower than before, there's no strong incentive to smuggle in the food, right? So the food supply decreased dramatically, and there's a shortage of food. Eventually, the city surrendered, right? So it's after a short period of time, it surrendered. So this demonstrating that price, is a mechanism to coordinate the allocation of resources to balance the supply and demand. If you're artificially set the price to be a certain level, it could generate artificial shortage, as in this case. It's not only lead to inefficiency, but in some circumstances, it can lead to the fall of a city, the fading of a war, right? So now, hopefully, after this analysis, I convinced you that price control, at least in the situation we have discussed, is not a good idea. So this get back to our discussion of unintended consequences, right? So price control, here price ceiling was intended to help the poor, but the unintended consequences is that it leads to inefficiency and is actually sometimes, most of the time, who hurt the poor who this policy was originally designed to help, right? So keeping this in mind, try to answer these following exercises. Which is one unintended consequences of rent control? We have 4 different choices here. Okay, let's take a look at your choice here. The second one is the most popular one, right? So the question, which is one unintended consequence of rent control? Landlord may not maintain rent unit. So here maintain meaning that you keep the maintenance of the rental unit, try to fix some issues, right? So that's what it means. I mean, this is exactly true as we talk about the supply side under rent control, right? So because of rent control, the rent is not allowed to rise to the equilibrium price. I mean, then the landlord would not have any incentive to keep their rental unit in a good condition, that the quality would be deteriorating, right? So that's why B is the correct answer. Why A is not the correct one? People in rent control unit will relocate more. Right? As we discussed the demand side under rent control, when you get into a rent controlled unit, that means it's a very affordable price. Right? So you probably don't want to move because it's such a good deal. As we illustrate, a lot of the congressmen, mayors, and rich people, Hollywood stars, when they get an apartment because it's such an affordable price, I mean, they would rather keep it, even though they are not living there. Right? So that's why A is just the opposite to the truth. People in rent control unit would not want to move at all. Right? And C, too many apartments will be built, creating a surplus of units. So this is just directly opposite to the truth. When the price is so low, the suppliers, the landlord, the real estate sectors, they are not willing to build more buildings because the profit they can get from rent is so low. Right? It's low, much lower than the equilibrium price. And then people will choose not to live in big cities. Well, this may be true, but is it the effect of rent control? Well, it's unclear, right? So if there's some influence of rent control in big cities, is because when you have rent control on the apartment in big cities, and those who are able to get those units because it's such an affordable price, they don't want to leave, right? So they will stick to the big cities, right? So D is an ambiguous answer, but the direct consequences of rent control on the willingness to live in big cities is for those who already have an apartment. I mean, they are probably more willing to live in the big cities. Right? For those who are not able to find something, I mean, they are forced to be out of the big city. So it's not a general description. Some people may be more willing to, and some are less willing to. Right? So D is an ambiguous answer. So that's why it cannot be the correct answer. So a correct answer must be true unconditionally. So B is the correct one. Right? Hope this is clear. Okay, so that's our discussion of price ceiling, right? We're using the rent control as an example. Now we goes to another type of price control. It's price floor. So we will use a minimum wage as one example. So minimum wage is a price floor applied to the labor market. Minimum wage below equilibrium wage, it will have no effect, right? Because it is not binding. The wage can still get into the equilibrium wage because of the coordination of supply and demand. But when minimum wage is above equilibrium wage, it will generate surplus of labor and unemployment, right? So surplus of labor, here we are talking about labor market, right? So in the labor market, employees, workers, are the suppliers of their labor service. When there is a surplus of labor, that means unemployment, right? And here we will have labor hired will be lower than unregulated market. right? So let's take a look at of the analysis using supply and demand. So here, without the minimum wage, we have the equilibrium wage, which is $9 per hour, and we will have 21 millions of hours provided per year in the labor market. If we impose a minimum wage of $10 per hour, what's going to happen? Any price lower than 10 will be illegal, so then the wage will be forced up to 10, right? So it cannot reach the equilibrium price 9. It will be forced on the level of 10. So here we will have the quantity demanded, meaning that the number of positions the firm will offer to hire people is 20 millions of hours. But the quantity supplied, the workers who are willing to work to offer their hours to earn wages will be much higher. That would be 22 millions of hours, right? So this generate a surplus of labor. And again, in the labor market, a surplus of labor is the same as unemployment, right? So that is the analysis in the labor market, right? So here we see when there are only 20 millions of hours supplied, because it's only 20 millions of hours purchased, right, hired by the companies. At this level of employment, the willingness to accept the minimum wage that some people are willing to accept is only $8, right? So if you're offering $8, some people at this level of employment, they are willing to work for you. But because it's minimum wage prescribed by the law is $10. Right? They can, I mean, some of the firms, I mean, of course, they prefer to pay you 8 so that they are able to hire you to work for them. But because they cannot go below 10, I mean, a lot of people who are willing to work are not able to work, generating this unemployment, this surplus of labor. Right? And also, we can do an analysis of inefficiency. When we have minimum wage, the minimum wage is above the equilibrium level, it would generate a deadweight loss. Okay, so because here we have the level of production or the level of supplied is only 20 millions at the wage of 10, right? And because the level is lower than the equilibrium level, we are having this deadweight loss. And here we have the firm surplus. I mean, firms are consumers here. The firm surplus is represented by this this blue triangle. And also we have the workers' surplus. Workers, they are offering their supplier of the labor. There's the workers' surplus. I mean, this pink part, it can be potentially the workers' surplus because now whenever they find a job, they are paid higher than the equilibrium price. I mean, that's a good deal for the workers who already have a job. But because of the situation of the minimum wage, and there's unemployment, it will be difficult to find a job, right? So the search cost of a new job is higher, right? So that means the workers who eventually get a job, I mean, it's a good deal for them because they are paid higher than their minimum willingness to pay, higher than the equilibrium price. But for people who are not able to find a job, it's just become very difficult for them to find a job. The search cost is high. The opportunity cost of searching of getting a job is high. So that's why this pink part, I mean, can be considered as potentially the workers' surplus. But because of the opportunity cost of searching a new job is higher than before, they are not able to capture all of this as the workers' surplus. Part of this can be lost due to job search. Right? So that's the analysis of efficiency when we have minimum wage. So there's part of deadweight loss that is for sure lost, right? So that's why it's called loss. But also for the pink part, I mean, it's also lost potentially because of the job search, the increased job search activity. So here are some other examples of price floor. Price support is just another name for price floor. Price support to agriculture is very common in the United States and the European Union. To implement price floor, what the government has to do is to buy up the surplus, right? So because when there is price floor, I mean the price is higher than the equilibrium price, there will be a surplus. I mean, if the price is high, who's gonna buy the surplus? I mean, because it's the government set this price floor, I mean, intentionally with the purpose to help the poor farmers. But that generates the surplus. But in order to implement the price floor, the government has to purchase those surplus, right? So that's a waste of money because the government have to use the taxpayers' money to purchase those surplus, right? So here is some examples. During the 1930s, the price support of Roosevelt's New Deal caused food to be deliberately destroyed when malnutrition was serious, right? Because you set the price high. I mean, a lot of people are not able to afford those food, right? So, but also it cost to deliver those food to the poor. So that's generated this quite interesting and unintuitive phenomena when there are food to be destroyed, but a lot of people are experiencing malnutrition. European unions, they have this guaranteed to the sugar companies a price that 3 times of the world price. So if you go to the supermarket to look at the price for sugar, I mean, you probably don't pay attention to it because you are used to it. But if you look at the price of sugar, it's almost 3 times compared to the world price if you go to another country outside of the European Union. Why is this the case? Because of the price floor, price support set by European Union to benefit the sugar companies, right? Even Finland produce sugar from beet, right? So beet is actually a very inefficient way of producing sugar, and also the sunlight is one important determinant to determine the yield of sugar, right? So Finland is definitely not a good country, good place, good location to produce sugar. But because of the price support set up by European Union, even Finland have this sugar growing farmers, right? And this sugar can actually be produced from canes in tropical for much lower cost, right? And also, we see sugar is dumped to poor countries at much lower price because in order to maintain this price support, the government need to purchase the sugar from the sugar grower, the beet grower. And what are they going to do with those sugars? I mean, they will just sell these sugars to some other countries at a much lower price, right? So it's called, in international trade term, it's called dumping. I mean, it's not only hurting the taxpayers in European Union, but it's also distort the market in some other countries. Also, we see that Canada has no sugar growers, but sugar is cheaper than the United States because price support for sugar also exists in the United States. And we also mentioned that at our lecture one, Coca-Cola in the United States tastes very differently from other countries because in the United States, sugar is quite expensive because of price support, right? And also at the same time, the United States government provide the subsidy to corn so that the corn syrup is significantly cheaper compared to sugar. So that's why the soft drink companies in the United States, they use corn syrup as a substitute to sugar, so making a special taste. I mean, that's how economic policies can influence the food we consume, right? And also you see that a lot of the food in the United States, they are corn-based because corn is so cheap compared to other food because of the subsidy provided by the government. So price support is meant to help family farmers, but most money would go to the big agricultural companies, right? So this is, again, unintended consequences. Sometimes when you impose a policy by the government, they're trying to help the people, right, producing those agricultural product, especially those family farmers. But because there are also other big agricultural corporations producing the same thing, eventually is those big corporations benefit most from this policy. Right? So it's actually against the very intention of this policy. Okay, before we end our discussion of price control, let's think about these following two questions. Is price control, including minimum wage, rent control, always bad? So now, so far in today's lecture, you only hear bad things about price control. But is there any situation under which price control can be reasonable? Right? Think about this. And another question, does price control always give rise to deadweight loss? Okay, so these two questions are related, right? So if price control does not give to deadweight loss, sometimes maybe increasing efficiency, then that means price control is not always bad. So we'll discuss this two questions after our break. It's a difficult question. It's not that easy to answer. So I can just give you the answers and to inspire you to think. So here are some answers to this question. I mean, in one word, it's not always bad. So it is bad when we are in a competitive market. So we have mentioned that in competitive market, it's good to always allow the market to play its role because the competition would among the sellers and the buyers would actually drive the allocation of resources to its best usage in the equilibrium. But when we have a market structure that is different from perfect competition, I mean the story may be slightly different. So here, if the housing market lacks competition, for example, if there's only one supplier or only several suppliers, so that there's no enough competition among the suppliers, rent control may be efficient because when there's one suppliers, for example, to illustrate this case, take this extreme, the suppliers can set a high price, right? Because it has the market power, it can set the price higher than the marginal cost. And also it leads to underproduction. So in this case, the government may impose this rent control, right? So just lower this price charged by the monopoly. I mean, in that case, that could increase efficiency. Right? And in the labor market, it's also the same. If the labor market lacks competition, for example, there's only one or several suppliers, right? So this is the so-called monopsony, right? So we have not discussed this, but if you look at the book chapter of the textbook on labor market, there's some discussion on monopsony. Monopsony meaning there's only one buyer in the market. So in the case of the labor market, when there is a big employer in the market, so for example, in a lot of the towns in the United States, the only big employer would be Walmart, right? A very huge supermarket. In that case, as the most powerful employers in this town, it has a great power of setting the wages to the workers. Right? It may just intentionally set a low price because it has a higher marginal bargaining power. In that case, minimum wage can be efficient because it can just raise the minimum wage to a efficient level, right? So usually, if in a perfectly competitive market in the labor market, so the employers would set the wage according to the marginal product or the returns they get from hiring one additional employees. But if there's only one employer, it would set the price lower than the marginal product, than the return they can get from one employee. In that case, minimum wage, setting the price higher, would be helpful for the market to be more efficient, right? So here is a good summary. So in perfectly competitive market, price control is always bad. But if we look at some other structure, when either side of the market have some market power, then this price control would make sense, right? So as we'll also look at some of the idea of externalities next lecture, price control in that case could also make sense, right? So in one word, price control is not always bad. It also depends on other factors like the market structure, right? And also externality that we introduced in our next lecture, right? So here is some discussion on the effect of minimum wage. So our theory shows that minimum wage is bad for the labor market. But is it really true? Do we have empirical evidence from the actual market? Well, in that case, the conclusion is not that clear. It may be that the labor market is not perfectly competitive. In some situations, minimum wage does not necessarily hurt the workers, right? So this video is a good summary, a good discussion is provided by the economist. So for the sake of time, you can just watch this video on your own so that you have a good understanding, a better understanding on the effect of minimum wage, right? Now, I think we are ready to move to our next topic, taxes. So here is a clip to one of the songs by the Beatles. So these songs, let me see whether I can play it for a while. It's called Taxman. Okay, so that's just the first lines of the lyrics. If you're interested, you can just finish listening to this song. And one key sentence here is there's one for you and 19 for me. What this lyric is referring to is just this tax imposed by the British government. It's actually the Beatles would need as a high earning band, right? A high earning individuals, they have to pay up to 95% of their earnings to the treasury in the British, right? So this is their way of complaining about this really heavy tax burden in the United Kingdom. And because of this, the Beatles actually try to avoid this tax by living outside of the United Kingdom so that they don't have to pay this 95% of taxes, right? So you see that the effect of taxes is actually reflected to popular cultures, like in the songs by the famous band and singers. And also we see the influence of tax in history, right? So here is this a great charter which established constitutional monarchy in England. So this imposed restrictions on the crown's, on the king's ability to levy taxation. I mean, this was imposed because of the heavy taxation by the king. I mean, that actually led to the change of regime in the British history, right? And also, tax is one important reason why United States of America now is independent from the United Kingdom because it's, this tax eventually led to the independence of USA. This is just a famous painting. It's illustrating this event called the Boston Tea Party event. So this Boston Tea Party protested the British Parliament's tax on tea in the 10th of May, 1773. I mean, basically, the British government decided to levy the taxes on the teas imported to the British, but they did not allow representations or representatives from the United States, and that then the Americans think is just unfair. Then it has this Boston Tea Party event, and eventually they has this independent war and become independent from the British rule, right? And also, when we look at taxes, you see this very dramatically different tax policies across the world, right? So here on the left, you see this effective tax rate, right? So it includes this income tax and also employee social security, meaning that you have to make a contribution to your pension that you can get back. So, but that means the part of the salary or wages you earn cannot get directly to your pocket, right? So part of them just go to the government, part of them go to your pension. So here, as you can tell, I told you that I live in Abu Dhabi, so it's a very dramatically different tax system, right? So in UAE, in Abu Dhabi, there's a zero income tax, right? And also in Denmark, is here, right? So it's actually close to, it's over 40% of your wages effective tax will be going to the government, right? And also we see on the right is just percentage of VATs. Denmark, it's 25% is also very high. In Abu Dhabi, when I worked, there's also zero VAT. Right? By the end of my employment there, I think that's at the end of 2018. I mean, they started to introduce this VAT of 10%, but before that, it's just complete tax-free, no income tax, no VAT. So now that illustrates this importance of discussing or understanding the effect of taxation. So now let's get back to the original question I asked you. The government want to discourage smoking and impose this $3 tax. Which way of levying the tax is more effective? Is make the producers pay the tax or make the smokers pay the tax, right? So I already reviewed the answer. In theory, it doesn't matter. The effect is exactly the same, regardless of which side of the market you want to impose the tax. And we'll see why that is the case. Right? So now let's first give a definition of tax. So sales tax is added to the price of the thing you buy. Sometimes it's also called VAT, right? Value-added taxes. And income taxes and pension contributions are deducted from your earnings, from your wages. One important question related to taxes is who really pays these taxes. Here, I put emphasis on the word really, right? So income tax nominally is the employees would pay the tax, right? And for the sales tax, I mean, also it seems that the consumers pays the tax, but in some other countries it's different. It's inherent in the price that the sellers sell these products. But when we look at the effect of tax, who really share the burden of the tax, that is the question of tax incidence. Tax incidence refers to the division of tax burdens between the buyers and sellers, between the two sides of this trade. So we see that we can claim that when the market price rises by a full amount of taxes, then the buyers pay the entire amount of tax. Right? So we look at the effect of tax before the tax and after the tax. If after the tax is imposed, the market price rises by a full amount of tax. Before the tax is like $5, and after imposing a $3 tax, now the consumers pay $8. Then we'll see the buyers pay the tax, right? This is regardless of how this tax is actually imposed, right? You can ask the sellers or the buyers to pay the tax, but even if you ask the sellers to pay the tax, but the sellers can raise the price of the full amount of the $3 tax, then it's still the buyers share the burden of tax, even though it was initially imposed on the seller. Right? On the other hand, if look at the other extreme, if the market price doesn't rise at all, then that's the seller pays the tax. Right? So you could say that before this tax, the market price is 5. After imposing this tax, even though it's the buyers pay the tax, but the market price after imposing tax still is $5. That means even though nominally is the buyers who initially pay the tax, but these buyers who share the burden, right? And if the market price rises by a lesser amount, then that means both the buyers and the sellers pay the tax, right? So tax incidence is just try to calculate the division of tax burdens, regardless of the form, regardless of which side of the market the law would impose the tax on. So that leads to our discussion, or this principle of the equivalence of a tax on buyers and sellers. This equivalence is telling us that the effect of tax is the same regardless of the side of the market on which the tax is imposed. Okay, so this is a quite important conclusion. This is maybe one of the most important conclusions you can take from our discussion of taxes, right? So again, tariff, we know Trump recently imposed this tariff on all the countries across the world. Tariff is a special form of taxes, right? So once the tariff is imposed, we can decide which side of the market, whether it's American consumers pay the tax or the suppliers in the other countries pay the tax, right? So nominally, it's actually the sellers pay the tax, or it's the sellers in the United States who actually get the products from other countries pay the tax. But eventually, who pay the tax? It doesn't matter. It actually depends on other forms. Regardless of which side of the tax is imposed on, there's an equivalence of the tax burden. So that's something we'll discuss. And the tax burden would eventually depends on the elasticity of the demand and the supply. Okay, so that's a preview of the conclusion. Now let's see how can we derive this conclusion. So here is the market on cigarettes. Right, so we have the supply, we have the demand, we have the quantity, the millions of packs of cigarettes sold per year, and we have so here without tax we have the equilibrium, which is represented by the intersection between the supply and demand. Right, so now we have the no tax equilibrium price is $6, and then the equilibrium quantity is 350 millions of packs sold each year. Right, so now let's think about the case where the $3 tax is imposed on the sellers. So what's going to happen when the tax is imposed on the sellers? I think about this. The conclusion is already indicated on the slide, right? So it says that supply would decrease. Right? Supply decrease, meaning the supply curve will shift up, right, by $3, right? So there are two ways to understand this, right? So you can see that when the $3 tax is imposed on the sellers, right, the sellers will be less willing to sell because now the profit is lower than before. So the supply must be decreased, right? A decreasing supply meaning that you shift the supply curve to the left. Okay, and because we have the quantity on the horizontal axis, shift to the left is also representing a shift up. Okay? So here, when we have $3 of tax imposed on the sellers, it can be understood as the production cost of the sellers is increased by this $3. Right? So a straightforward way to understand the effect on the supply is that the supply curve will shift up by $3, right? Because that represented increase in production cost by $3, right? So now, after this imposition of a tax, we have a new supply curve, which represented by this pink curve, right? And the difference between the new curve and the old curve is just the $3 tax. So far, so good. Okay, now we have a new equilibrium, right? So we have a new equilibrium price, which is $8, and also the new equilibrium quantity is 325, right? So after we have the new trading price, $8, what is the amount the buyers pay? I mean, that is the market price, $8, right? And what is the money that the sellers can get? I mean, it's just the $8 minus the $3 tax paid to the government, and which leads us to 5, which is the money that the sellers can get. Okay, try to follow my logic. Now we see here at the equilibrium, this new equilibrium, the quantity decreased from 350 to 325. So this is the old equilibrium, this is the new equilibrium. And the price paid the buyers rise from the original $6 now to $8. But the sellers also receive a lower price or lower revenue. Right? They used to receive $6, the old equilibrium price for each pack of cigarettes. Now they can only receive $5, right? So represented by this point. It's just the price the buyers pay minus the $3 tax. Right? So this is telling us when we compare the new equilibrium to the old equilibrium, the buyers pay $2 more and the sellers receive $1 less. Okay, and of course the government receive this $3 as their government revenue. So that is the effect when the tax is imposed on the sellers. Now let's look at the other form of the tax when the $3 tax is imposed on the buyers. Okay, so when the $3 tax is imposed on the buyers, what's going to happen? I mean, that would definitely influence the demand. Okay, when $3 is imposed on the buyers, the willingness to pay by the buyers will be lower, will be $3 lower for each unit of this quantity, right? So that means the demand curve will shift down by $3. Okay, so here is the old demand curve and the old equilibrium. After $3 is imposed on the consumers, on the buyers, the new demand will shift down by $3. Okay, and then, I mean, this is just the benefit or the willingness to pay by the buyers is $3 less than before. Right? So after you get this new demand curve, we see we get the new equilibrium. So now the buyers would pay $5 to the seller in the market, but at the same time, the buyers would also need to pay $3 to the government. And you see here, after this analysis, the sellers get 5 still, right? So that's the new equilibrium price. The buyers would pay 5 plus the $3, that is $8. Right? So in comparison to the old equilibrium price where the buyers pay 6 and the sellers receive 6, now the buyers pay $2 more and the sellers pay $1, receive $1 less. This implies that the buyers pay $2 of the tax and sellers pay $1 of the tax. So if you compare this conclusion with the previous slides, when the tax is imposed on the seller, it's also buyers pay $2 more and sellers pay $1 less. So this is telling us, even though these two forms of taxes imposed on different side of the market, but the eventual tax burden is exactly the same. It's always that the buyers pay $2 more and the sellers pay the dollars, and the sellers would receive $1 less, meaning that buyers would pay $2 of tax and sellers would pay $1 of the tax. So this is telling us if we consider the effect of tax, we can consider it as a wedge that generated between the price the consumers pay and the price the sellers receive, right? So that means when we look at the equilibrium, this is the old equilibrium without tax. Now we impose $3 tax. What we'll do is just we move this point to the left until the difference between the demand curve and the supply curve is 3. That means that is the point where the price the buyers pay and the price that suppliers receive is just $3, is just the amount of tax. So what we'll do is when we impose $3 tax, we just move from this equilibrium quantity to the left until the difference between the demand curve and supply curve is $3. Right? So that means this tax is just creating a wedge between the price buyers pay and the price sellers receive. So with the tax, the equilibrium quantity is where the vertical gap between the curves equals the size of the tax, right? So this is what we derive from the previous two slides. Right? Regardless of whether the tax is imposed on the buyers or sellers, the effect is the same. You just create a wedge between the demand curve and the supply curve. Okay, so in the future, when you try to analyze the effect of tax, you don't need to move. You don't even need to shift the demand curve or the supply curve. You can just move to find the quantity where the difference between these two curves is just the amount of tax. Okay, so that is the effect of tax. Tax as a wedge. Okay, so that is the effect on the market equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. Okay, now let's have a look at the implications on efficiency when we impose the tax. So here, we are looking at another market when we impose $200 tax on tablet computer. Okay, so what is going to happen to this market? Without this tax, we see if it's a competitive market, it's an efficient market. We have equilibrium price $600 for this tablet, and the equilibrium quantity is 5 million of tablets are sold each week. So here we see the marginal social benefit represented by the demand curve, and the marginal social cost represented by the supply curve is exactly the same. That means here we maximize the total surplus, right? So we have the consumer surplus and producer surplus. Here at the equilibrium is where the total surplus is maximized. Now, when we impose this $200 tax, right? So let's first try to see where the new equilibrium is, right? So now the equilibrium quantity is 5. What we need to do to look at the effect of $200 tax is to move from this quantity to the left so that the difference between the demand curve and the supply curve is 200, right? So that's where that's about the quantity 3, right? So at quantity 3, the price the buyers pay is $700, and the price received by the seller is $500. The difference is exactly 200. Right? So now these 2 points represent the new equilibrium. Here at the new equilibrium quantity, we know it's less than the efficient level of production, right? So we are having an underproduction, right? So we know from the analysis of topic 5, this would lead to this deadweight loss, right? Because of underproduction. Well, again, if we look at this for the quantity 3 to 5, the corresponding benefit received by the sellers, received by the consumers, is greater than the production cost for the sellers, right? So if these products are produced and traded in the market, the consumers are better off. But that increases the value. But because we're not producing this quantity, this potential value can be created or not created. So that's a loss of efficiency represented by the deadweight loss. Now, we also see that the consumer surplus, which is used to be this big rectangle, the whole green area, now it's much smaller, represented by the smaller triangle. And the producer surplus is also shrinked from this big triangle to the smaller triangle. So that means both the consumer and the producers are worse off because of the tax policy. Right? Now, what about this pink rectangle? I mean, I already indicated it. It is the tax revenue received by the government. Okay, because for each unit of tablet in the market, the government would receive $200 as their tax revenue. And 3 million of tablets are traded in the market. So that means the total tax revenue is just 200 multiplied by this 3, represented by this rectangle, right? So this rectangle, pink rectangle, I mean, that should be purple, I guess. Purple rectangle represents the tax revenue by the government. Right? So the net effect of this tax policy is that now we see the buyers would pay a higher price, the sellers would receive a lower price, lower revenue, and we generated some deadweight loss, but at the same time, the government would receive some tax revenue. I mean, it can be used to for some other uses to increase the social welfare. Right? And here, if you look at the new equilibrium, the marginal social benefit is $700 is greater than the marginal social cost, right? So they are not the same, meaning that we are not reaching this allocation efficiency. So that leads to this deadweight loss, right? So here, if I ask you to calculate the tax revenue, it's just 200 multiplied by 3. That's $600 million. And how about the deadweight loss? I mean, if you remember the formula to calculating the area of a triangle, right? So that is 1/2 of this $200 multiplied by the height of this triangle. That is 2, right? So the deadweight loss is $200 million. Okay, so that is the effect of taxes. Any questions so far? No questions? All right. So if we look at this special case, if I ask you the tax incidence, can anyone tell me what is the share of the buyers and what is the share of the sellers? In other words, out of the $200 of taxes, how much is paid by the seller and how much is paid by the buyer? If we look at the case of cigarettes, right? We see here, the buyers pay a larger amount. The buyers pay 2/3 of the taxes, and the sellers pay 1/3 of the taxes. Right? So the buyers would have a higher burden. Right? If we look at this case, the buyers would pay $100 for the tax, right? Why is that the case? The buyers used to pay $600. Now the new price, under the new price, they need to pay $700, right? So that means the buyer will need to pay 1/2 of the tax. And also we can see that the sellers used to receive $600 for each tablet they sell. Now they can only receive $500. So that means the sellers would also pay $100. So in this special case, the tax burden between these two sides are exactly the same. Okay, so what determines this tax burden? So it turns out that the answer would be in the next slides. It depends on the relative elasticity of the demand and the supply. Okay. I saw a question on in the chat. Let me see. Why is there a deadweight again? Why the firm cannot produce $3 to $5 billion? Well, because the firms are trying to maximize their profit, right? So in this case, when you are imposing this $200, if you look at here, I mean, this is from the equilibrium analysis. So I mean, it's a question that you have to start from the very beginning. So when you impose the tax, it's equivalent to moving this demand curve or supply curve, right? Then you reach the new equilibrium. And in the new equilibrium, that's where the firms and the consumers maximizing their benefits or profit, right? And because of this, we know that the tax would actually generating a wedge between the supply and demand. So that's the new equilibrium. Right. So why the firm back to the question, why the firm is only producing 3? Because that's the equilibrium, right? So that's the equilibrium that maximize its profit, right? So it only produces 3. Okay, good. Now back to the question, how do we determine the tax incidence? And the answer to that question is the relative elasticity of the supply and demand. Right? So here we have 2 cases. We have perfectly inelastic demand and perfectly elastic demand. Right? So the idea is that when we have more inelastic demand, then we will have a larger share by the buyers. Recall that elasticity representing the flexibility or responsiveness of the sellers or the buyers. When we have more inelastic demand, meaning that the buyers would be not so responsive to the change in price. They don't have a lot of alternative. In this case, they will share a larger burden of the tax. So now compare these 2 cases when we have perfectly inelastic demand, meaning that the buyers have no choice of other alternative. So in this case, they will share a very large burden of the tax. Right? So here, the tax wedge, because we have a vertical curve, it's just this $0.2 dollars. This means the buyers would pay the entire tax. On the other hand, when we have a perfectly elastic demand, the net the net effect of the tax is just again create this wedge between the demand and the supply. Now you see the price the buyers pay is exactly the same as before. It's still $1, but the price that the sellers receive is just entire tax amount. Right? So here in this case, it says that the sellers would share the entire burden. When we move to elastic to inelastic demand, the buyers would carry a higher burden of the tax. Or in other words, when the demand become more elastic, meaning that these consumers would have more other choice, more alternatives, they will be very responsive to the price. In that case, the buyers would share a less burden. The sellers would share a higher burden of the tax. Okay. Similarly, if we look at the 2 cases with perfectly inelastic and perfectly elastic supply, the idea is the same. When we have perfectly inelastic supply, meaning that the sellers have no choice but to sell these products, right? So they will share the entire burden. The sellers would pay the entire burden of the tax. When we have perfectly elastic supply, then the sellers would pay nothing of the tax. It's mainly the buyers pay the tax, right? So here when with the case of perfectly elastic supply, there's no effect on quantity, and also we see the sellers would pay the entire tax. When we have perfectly elastic supply, it has a significant influence on quantity, and also the buyers pay the entire tax. Okay, so that's the influence of the tax burden depending on the elasticity of supply and demand. Right. So there's ongoing discussion on who's going to pay for the tariffs imposed by Donald Trump. I mean, Donald Trump actually claimed that it's just the producers, the Chinese producers, the Vietnamese producers pay the entire tax, and so the U.S., the American government would collect the tax revenue that they can reduce the income tax of the Americans. But it's not the case, as we'll see. I mean, who pay the tax? Eventually, the effect would depend on the elasticity of the supply and demand, right? So when Trump actually imposed the tax on almost all the countries, the products from all the countries, the American would have no other choice, right? So all these taxes are increased. In that case, the elasticity of demand would be relatively low, right? So it has a inelastic demand. So that means, I mean, all in all, it would be the American would pay a higher burden on the tariffs, right? So something that we'll discuss in more detail when we move to the topic of international trade. Now, to help you have a deeper understanding of this, how this elasticity would influence tax and also tax revenue, let's look at one case study. So this is the case of short-living luxury tax. In 1990, the United States established a special luxury tax, which is this 10% surcharge on new aircraft, yachts, automobiles, furs, and jewelries. So only the rich people are experiencing this tax. Only when you purchase this luxury good, you need to pay this 10% surcharge. So the tax was expected to generate approximately $2 billion a year as tax revenue. However, if you look at the result, the tax revenue fell far from expectation. And at the same time, thousands of jobs were lost in the affected industry, right? So this is, again, an example of unintended consequences. So when you look at the corresponding tax, I mean, the estimated tax revenue is based on the current quantity of consumption. I mean, that's also the rationale of how Trump and his government calculate the expected tax revenue after imposing the tariff without considering the effect on the traded quantity in the market, right? So especially the case when you have luxury tax, the tax revenue far below expectation. Why is this the case? I mean, because of this unexpected low tax revenue, the tax was repealed within a year. Let me see. Well, within 3 years. So now the question for you to think about, why did the luxury tax fail to raise expected tax revenue? Okay, so for the sake of time, I can tell you that this is related to the relative elasticity of supply demand. For luxury good, as we have mentioned, it has really high elasticity, right? So it's not necessity. It is fine for you to consume, it's fine for you not to consume because they are not necessary for you to have. So that's why for this special type of good, the demand is very elastic. So that means when you create this tax, it has a huge influence on the quantity. Okay, so that means if you want to be successful in tax revenue, you probably want to choose special market. Right? So a related question for you to think about. Now, because you study economics so well, you become an economic advisor for our Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen. Right? So she plans to raise taxes in order to raise the revenue for the government. And she is considering the following two goods, of which the supplies and demands are shown. Which good do you suggest her imposing taxes on in order to be most effective in raising tax revenue? So this question is related to this case study of luxury tax. Which good do you think is a good market for you to impose tax on? Good A or good B? Now I really want you to think for this question. I can tell you the good B. Great. Yeah, you got for the answers I received in the chat box is correct, right? So we will conduct a thorough analysis after Easter, right? So we will see each other in 2 weeks. We will wrap it up to have a formal analysis explaining why B is the correct market to impose tax on, right? It's related to the relative elasticity of the supply demand. So here we have relative inelastic supply demand. It's a good choice for imposing tax. When you have a market with really elastic supply demand, it actually would significantly decrease the quantity, and that would be a nightmare for you to collect taxes because it's destroy the market and significantly decrease the quantity traded in the market. Okay,